Hello, and welcome to Loyola Marymount University. My name is Dennis Draper, and I'm the Dean of the College of Business Administration. Each year, we are fortunate to bring in a number of prominent business executives and special guest speakers to participate in our CBA lecture series. From high-ranking government officials, to leading journalists, to internationally acclaimed social entrepreneurs. All of our distinguished speakers share one common goal: to educate our students and local community on some of the biggest issues in global business today, all while reinforcing LMU's underlying mission of teaching business with ethics and social responsibility. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the presentation.
It is my pleasure to have Mr. J. David Power as our guest tonight. It's an honor to have him here, and welcome, Mr. Power.
Thank you.
He's an internationally recognized leader in market research. Dave Power spent half a century as a pioneer in studying consumer opinion, with 40 of those years as the founder of J.D. Power and Associates, one of the most prestigious marketing information companies in the world. The company's reputation as a premier resource for customer satisfaction data and consultation has led to research and projects in automotive, financial services, telecommunication, travel, home builders, utilities, and healthcare industries. They've sold the company to the McGraw-Hill companies in 2005 and retired in 2009. Dave frequently speaks to the top management and boards of directors of companies worldwide and to the students and faculty at various universities and colleges. Following graduation from College of Holy Cross in 1953, Dave served for 4 years as a line officer in the U.S. Coast Guard. He subsequently earned an MBA from Wharton School of Finance and Commerce at the University of Pennsylvania. He joined Ford Motor Company and later worked for McCann Erickson as a marketing research consultant for General Motors. In 2014, Dave was inducted into the Automotive Hall of Fame in a formal ceremony. In 2010, Dave received the Joseph P. Wharton Award for Lifetime Achievement from Wharton Alumni Association of New York. He holds honorary doctorate degrees from College of Holy Cross, California Lutheran University, and California State Northridge. I welcome you again to LMU and College of Business.
Thank you.
Dr. David Stewart, President, Professor of Marketing and Law, editor of Public Policy and Marketing Journal, and editor of several other highly regarded journals prior to that, is here tonight to join Dave for a conversation. He will also moderate audience question at the end of this conversation, and I come back and tell you about the reception and book signing at that point. Dave Stewart.
But we just heard about your life, and for many entrepreneurs, people think that life begins when you start the company. You did a lot of things before you started your company. What were some of the things that you learned along the way?
Well, it was a long, long way to get started, but actually, I think one of the most important things is to understand people and to work with people. And I think my time in the Coast Guard was the most formative in that regard. I was on an icebreaker, had never been on a ship in my life. I get my commission and get on the icebreaker, and I end up going to the Arctic and spending 6 months up in the Arctic. And I had a whole crew of people that worked for me, and also I had to obey the commands of the commanding officer. And I found out that that is a difficult thing to do. And so I had a rough time at first, but I finally got to understand the ropes. And I think that was the biggest change for me. I had lived at home, went to college at home, and then I go in the Coast Guard. So that would be the most important thing as far as getting started. Understanding how to work with people, for people, and actually supervise people.
Okay. Your introduction to the automobile industry began in Detroit. And,
Yes.
So maybe you can tell us a little bit about the industry at that time.
Well, the automobile industry at that time was the big three, and they were trying to keep American motors alive. And General Motors had nearly 50% share of the market, and they knew it all. I think that it's best described by the President Eisenhower, who said the greatest threat to the United States at the time he was running the country was the dominance of the automotive industry. And he wanted to tone it down a bit. And the executives were very successful. They all earned their stripes when the World War II was underway, and it was a tremendous time to show the might of the industry that the United States had in actually first defeating Japan and then defeating Germany. And I think that that was a big thing for the country, and they were all proud of it. And the automobile industry built the airplanes, the tanks, and a lot of the gunnery that helped win the war. So they were riding high, and there was a demand for automobiles that grew and grew, and they went at it. But I found that when I went to work for Ford Motor Company, 1 out of 7 jobs at that time in the United States were as a result of the automobile industry. And I thought that it was the place to get started. And at Ford Motor Company, I found out that they shipped me off to the tractor division, which was a small division in Michigan. And I was made I was told that I was going into finance. And I said, well, I'm a marketing major. And they said, well, it'll give you a good start. Train with us for 2 years, and you can then switch over to marketing. And it came about that the tractor division was under a lot of pressure. There was a point in time when tractors and Ford tractors ruled the roost in those days. They were in charge, and what happened is the farm industry changed rather rapidly, but people didn't understand it. The family farm began to disappear, and Ford Tractor had small tractors that fit the small farm, but they didn't have big tractors where most of the industry was swinging. So I saw they were going under, and after 2 years, I tried to shift over to marketing research, and I went to the director of market research at Ford Motor Company's home office and in Dearborn, Michigan. And the head of the department asked me, he asked me a number of questions at the beginning, but then he said, Dave, what do you want to be, say, 10, 15 years out in this organization? And I thought to myself, well, I have to say something fairly good, but not too good. And I ended up saying, well, I'd like to be the vice president of marketing at, say, Lincoln or Mercury divisions. And that was the end of the interview. And I found out that he wanted a career person to go through it. And I realized after I left, I said I better find a job elsewhere. And that's when I ended up going to McCann Erickson, who had just changed things. But it was a learning experience.
So how did you get from Detroit to Los Angeles?
Well, actually, it was an interesting thing. I went to work for another tractor manufacturer when I left Ford, and it was J.I. Case, and they were a little bit better than Ford in terms of their financial resources, but I soon found that they were in the same type of problem. They didn't have the larger tractors or combines in their thing, and they were going out of business. And it was in Racine, Wisconsin, and if you've ever been in a winter in Racine, Wisconsin, I was ready to leave the location. And I got a call from my former boss in Detroit, and he said, we'd like to hire you back. And I said, well, I don't want to work in Detroit. And he says, well, it so happens we have a job opening to run our office in Los Angeles. And I said, twist my arm a little bit more and I might go. And that's where we went. My son Jamie was about 2 years old, I think, at the time, and we ended up and found a house to rent on Loyola Boulevard. And that's how we got started here. So life goes on.
And what were you doing when you first got to Los Angeles?
I was working for Marplan, market research company that was a division of Interpublic group of companies, McCann Erickson and others. And I was doing market research and learned a lot. Again, 3 years at that.
So what was it that brought you to start your own business?
Well, the companies I worked for weren't listening to the, and what I found out is that the research, market research that they were doing was done to justify what they had already set out to do instead of having it independently run. And I felt that there had to be a better way of doing it. And I started doing my job independently, and I quit the job with Marplan and ended up starting my own company, and by that time we had 2 more children, so the 3 children and my wife did all the work, and I did all the selling. We did market research, and the kids would, they were 3, 4, and 5 years old. And we had them working at the kitchen table, and then also to stuff the envelopes for mailing out the questionnaires. They'd use the living room floor and fold the questionnaires, put the cover letter in, and a quarter was the incentive in those days, taped to the letter and the return envelope, and they put the stamp on. My wife insisted that the stamp had to be just perfect, and the kids did it and stuffed the envelopes. We would mail them out and get the returns, and my wife did the tabulating while the children were napping. So that's how we got started.
Okay. When you began doing your surveys, what did you see the purpose of the surveys to be?
Well, actually, what I felt was that we should do it in a straightforward fashion. And in those days, the market research firms could only work for one company in an industry. Mm-hmm. And just like the ad agencies, if you worked for Ford, you couldn't work for GM. And I felt that the research was biased that way, and the people that purchased the research didn't understand really what they were getting back, and then they would edit the data until it, we called it, they'd torture the data until it confessed. And that's the way work was being done. And that's really opened my eyes, and I said, we got to do something differently. And that's when we started doing our own surveys across the whole industry. And what we found is that when we started selling the results, the big 3 car companies in Detroit were death against us doing it and didn't want us to do it that way. But we kept at it, and we got the Japanese companies in Southern California, Toyota, Honda, Datsun at the time, and they helped us survive the onslaught, and we were able to eventually build it up so that it was a much more respected survey. And in 1980, we had our first customer satisfaction survey. And this was, we put in, we covered all of the car companies' products and put it all together and started selling the results that way. And eventually we found that some of the companies were actually, again, changing the data once they got it. And before I knew it, it was 1984. We did it on an annual basis. In 1984, we had the results come in, and number 1 in the survey of customer satisfaction was Mercedes-Benz, and the number 2 one was a Japanese company not well known at the time, and we were able to get the results published. And one day, one Sunday afternoon during the Super Bowl, we were at home, my wife and I, watching the Super Bowl, and in the middle of the game, we had a commercial came up on the screen of the TV, and it says, according to J.D. Power and Associates, Subaru is second only to Mercedes-Benz and in customer satisfaction. And we were amazed that it was on TV. Come to find out, our statistician had been called a couple of weeks before that and asked if that was true. And he told them yes, and so they allowed it to go on. But Subaru actually used half their annual budget to run that one commercial. And that put us on the Wall Street Journal and everything else, all the newspapers and radio stations in those days. So that's how these things happen, and we stuck with it. And by 1990, I would say we were running very strong. We had an investigation, not in Jamie, what's the TV? 2020, the TV program, and they said that they would come out and analyze what we were doing. And I talked with our lawyer and talked about it, and he said, well, you really don't have anything to hide, so why not go with it? So as it happens, we were on a 20-minute segment again, and they didn't find anything wrong with what we were doing, and they blasted some of the other ratings around, and it was the best, another good stroke of luck and maybe genius to some degree. And that's how we kept building the business.
Well, you've not only started a marketing research business, but you really changed the paradigm of the way people looked at market research and feedback from customers. But in doing that, you had to be not just a market researcher, but a bit of a salesman, a bit of an entrepreneur. How did you see your role during those days?
Oh boy, I wore a dozen hats in those days. But I actually what we found out is that once the car companies, top management began to look at the data, they liked it. And especially if they got the top ratings. And so we were able to get in to see the chief executives of all the car companies eventually, and this included all the imports as well. And I could get in the door and talk with the CEOs and had a good conversation. And actually my wife at the time enjoyed it too. When we would go to dinner, I'd kick her, try to kick her in the legs because she was challenging some of our clients, and they loved it.
Well, there was a turning point with the media. You talked about your relationships with the media. There was a turning point related to Mazda. Can you tell us a little bit about
yes.
that?
Well, one of the first studies we did, the Mazda came in, it was 1972. They came in 70, but they weren't full run until 71. And they had a new engine, the rotary engine. And it took the country by storm. And they were selling them as fast as they could import them. And we decided to do a survey of the first 2,000 buyers. Sent the mail, our conventional mail survey to them. And I remember coming home at night from the, by then we had an office on Wilshire Boulevard. And I'd come home with the questionnaires, and my wife was doing the tabulations. And she had a spreadsheet that was about this wide and had all the tick marks on there. And she said, you know, Mazda has an O-ring problem. And I said, what's an O-ring? And she says, I don't know, but look at this. And what we found is 1 out of 5 vehicles that had reached 30,000 miles or more had this O-ring, which caused the engine to break down. They'd have to replace the engine and put new O-rings in it. And it was amazing to me. My experience back in Detroit, I knew that if you had a 2 or 3% failure rate, you had a problem. But this was 20%. And so we published the report, and we had 14 car companies subscribe to the report. Mazda didn't subscribe to it. They didn't want to have anything to do with us. And what happened is, about 2 weeks after we published it, I got a call from the Wall Street Journal bureau chief in Detroit. I'm here in Los Angeles. And he said, started asking me questions about the study. And I didn't know that he would have that information, but I could tell when he started, I could almost hear him flipping the pages, and he came in with general information and then got to this O-ring failure. And I said, I told him that, how did you get this information? And he said, well, we have our sources. And he wouldn't tell me any more than that. And I said, well, I wish you'd have look at my press release before you publish the data, because I want a balanced picture of it. He said, well, you better get it to me right away. Now, this is in 1972, 73, and we didn't have, I'm here in Los Angeles, his in Detroit. It's already 3 hours ahead of me. And I finally figured out we should get a telex machine. And I don't know if anyone here knows what a telex machine is. But we found the building on Wilshire Boulevard that had one. And I wrote my first press release. It was on a yellow pad, and we got the gal that ran the machine. I paid her $10 or $5, I guess it was, which was a lot of money in those days. But she typed it up and sent it off to them. The next day, we're on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And that put us, another thing that put us on the map, and everyone listened. And the first call I got was from Mazda, wanting to know what was going on. And I said, well, I've been trying to see you for 2 years, and you won't talk to me. So I got in the door, and he had a cutaway of the engine. I saw what a O-ring was. It's a rubber band, and the engine had 2 of them, and they were failing. And I found out that the general manager found out right while I was there from the service manager that they had 2 engineering changes on the O-ring, which I knew that they knew something was going wrong. The general manager didn't know anything about it. So from that day on, he said to me, I want you on my side the next time. So he was open to listen to what I had to say.
Good. Well, since we're speaking about models of cars, most of us remember the DeLorean as the star of the movie Back to the Future, but there was a DeLorean Motor Company, right? Did you
Yes.
work with them?
Very much so. As a matter of fact, the DeLorean's VP of marketing was the head of general manager of Mazda, and he went over there and he had us do the pre-research around Los Angeles. We had to do it in Beverly Hills and high-income locations, and we did the research for that. I went to Italy with DeLorean after he got the money from the federal government of Britain, and they started building the cars in Northern Ireland, and actually they shipped them over here, and they had about 100 of them. They flew them in because they were late by aircraft, and in Orange County they had them lined up there, and that's when DeLorean got caught by the FBI, and it all fell apart. So there's maybe a couple of hundred of them still roaming around. I've run into people that have talked about it. But that was something DeLorean was over his head, and I could see that working out. And Dick Brown, who was his VP of marketing, I said, you better resign before the roof falls in. And he did.
Well, you've had to overcome a lot of skepticism and resistance over the years, particularly early in your business. Do you have any advice for folks in the audience about how do you go about taking a critic and turning them into a friend and client?
Well, it takes a while, but I think that what we did was we didn't design it that way, but it was the press that took us up to the top management. And it was all those breaks that we had along the way. And the more they, CEOs of the companies started seeing that, the more they wanted to actually use our data.
Okay. Well, you've been in a very unique position to look at an industry worldwide. You've been on, I think, every continent except maybe Antarctica.
No, I've been to
You've been to Antarctica too, okay.
On the icebreaker. I was on
okay.
Operation
Great.
Deep Freeze 1.
All right. But you've been in a unique position where you could get a sense of cultural differences around the voice of the customer and the notions of quality. Do you have any thoughts about how customers differ across the world in terms of how they view those things?
Oh, it is different, but I think that it's in the United States we have really an open system. And in Europe and in Japan and in China now, the government controls a lot of what goes on. In the United States, the information is rather public. We get automotive registrations on a regular basis, so we can order them on, say, 3,000 of them, and we give the specifications to R.L. Polk, who manages those, and we can get them. And here and in Canada, we have good access. In Europe, they try to keep us out, the manufacturers. There's a consortium of the manufacturers, but we get around it one way or another. And in China now, that's wide open, and that's the biggest market for J.D. Power and Associates other than the United States, and it's growing day by day.
Well, speaking of cultural differences, there was a scandal involving Honda and some financial kickbacks. Can you talk a little bit about how that came about and the impact on your organization?
Yes. Well, we actually do proprietary work for individual manufacturers, which only goes to them, and it's usually of their own customers. And we did our first nationwide study for Honda back in 1978, 80. And they had us interview customers of each dealership, and we would report the results back to them. And we were able to give them a good understanding of their what their dealers were doing. And we found out that some of the dealers were making Xerox copies of our questionnaire and sending them out to their relatives of the employees, and sending those back into the thing. But we could read that they were dummies, and we took them out of the processing system that we had. So really what happened is that I think that Honda was selling more cars than they could provide, and what we found is that the dealers were complaining. I had a good interchange with the automobile dealers as well as the manufacturers, and I knew there was something going on, and they wouldn't talk about it. But what we found is that the staff of Honda, the Americans, were taking kickbacks from dealers, so much for a car, like $200 or $300 for a car. We'll get you another car. And at the time, we had the voluntary restraints agreement on the Japanese car companies. They could only bring in so many cars. So Honda was riding high with that in the 1980s. And that also led to them messing around with the availability of the vehicles. Some dealers were very upset about it and would sort of tell me about it, but they didn't want to do it. And so eventually I wrote a letter to the general manager of Honda, Japanese general manager. I sent it to his home by registered mail, so I knew he got it. And I knew he wouldn't get it if it went through the system. He met with me, and he was upset. But I could tell that he knew a little bit more than he let on to me. And what happened is he got transferred back to Japan, and it sort of kept going on. And I lost all the business with Honda because of the American staff shutting us down. And by 1989, the end of the voluntary restraints agreement was over, and they could bring in as many cars as they wanted to, and which they did. And then the roof hit in a recession, and the dealers were complaining about it. One of the dealers lost his franchise in New Hampshire, and I didn't know him personally, but I knew that that was the beginning of it. And so they finally had a investigation, and I got called in to be a witness in the thing. And I actually was asked to be in the trial, and I closed the trial, and 3 of the executives were found guilty and given 5 years in the federal penitentiary. And then the whole Honda organization was let go. This would be in 91, 92. And they had to start all over again with a new staff. And
So you've had a career in law enforcement too, right?
oh, yes.
Okay, good.
And some of the dealers told me I better watch out.
You've been very successful in your business. Maybe you could share with the audience a little bit about your management style and the values that have driven you and the organization.
Well, we'd have sessions where we get people representing. We had around 800 employees at the time in the late 99 and into 2001, 2002. And we were able to catch on to, excuse me, I'm losing my train of thought on that. What did you ask?
I was asking about your management style and
the management
values
style.
that drove
Well,
the company.
the management style, actually, we tried to make everyone available to. I would use a system. I'd go around at 5 o'clock, go down and check on who was working and who wasn't. They called it bed check. And we would I'd get into conversations with anyone that was ready to talk and hear what they were thinking. And what we did was we tried to get the people to operate like they're part of a family. And we wanted that kind of reaction from them and support what we were doing. And I think that worked very well with us. And today, all the people that are now retired, we get together and talk at times. And I think it's the style that I had developed. Again, it goes back to the days in the Coast Guard.
Well, before we turn it over to the audience, I have just one last question for you, and that's, where do you see the automobile industry going? We hear things about driverless cars, and we hear things about buying automobiles at Walmart, and lots of things about where the automobile industry might go. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'd say the industry is at a crossroads right now. It's being challenged, and I think that we're going to see the disappearance of the automobile dealer as we know it, and as they know it, and they're upset. Tesla came in with the electric vehicle, and they're trying to sell direct to the consumer, and I think that's a type of thing that's going to be happening. And I think the technology is growing at a very rapid rate, and this is bringing about change faster than people can keep up with it. And that reminds me of the situation I developed in 1970. A Japanese executive, young man from Toyota, came to me. He was getting his master's degree at USC, and he had a book, and he had to write a paper on it. And he bought an extra copy for me and asked me to help him out with it. And it happened to be one of the most impressive books as far as I'm concerned. And it was Alvin Toffler's Future Shock. And it was this young Japanese gentleman that got me involved in it. And I became friendly with Al Toffler, and he has been instrumental in my thinking about the way things are changing. And he did his second major book was The Third Wave, and that was to show that went from the agricultural era to the industrial. And I think that what he's saying, that industrial is going by the boards, and it's going to be the information age. And I think that, and things are going to get more rapid in the change than ever before. And I think we're going to see this going on. Nobody really wants to address it, but we're going to see some very rapid change. And it's going beyond the information age. Now we're into the digital age, and that's going to move it even faster. And I think that the opportunities for that are just tremendous. But there's going to be a lot of hardship in the change that is going on. I think middlemen are going to disappear, and it's all going to be direct with your pad.
Well, maybe we can take a few questions from the audience. Don't be bashful. Questions? Just raise your hand.
Did I put them to sleep?
I don't know. Yes.
Okay. I didn't.
She said, how did you decide what to survey? Was it your clients, or how did you decide on the actual content?
Well, sometimes they would ask us to do a certain survey, but most of the time, what we felt was we should come up with the ways to measure things. Like the O-ring problem would never have been covered if we hadn't gone out and done it ourselves. And I think that that is perhaps the most way of doing things the way I feel they should be done. And we don't want the interference. The market research manager at the car companies didn't want to, they lost their power when we showed up, and they didn't like it. So we had to contend with middlemen in the organization, and getting around those was very important to us to have access to the top management. And that's the way we did it. But we would come up with ideas on how to get this information that we felt was necessary for them to hear. Most of the time they didn't realize it. We did it for them.
Yes.
Do you have a particular project that was most significant, that you didn't know it at the time, but became significant? And then also, what are you most proud of?
Okay. A significant, well, actually, I think that the Subaru advertisement was the one that was the most telling, that we had done it. We didn't realize it, how to get the word out to the press, but Subaru advertised it, and that made us create a advertising program where we controlled how the advertising was to be done. And so when they purchased the study, they agreed to our standards. And I think that was perhaps the most interesting thing. We didn't really intend to go that way, but it happened, so we were able to do it. And then you said, what was I most
Proud of.
proud of? Well, actually, I think it's my family. Yes.
Yes.
What advice would you give to the GM CEO now, given the problems that they're experiencing?
The General Motors? Oh, I'm not going to give her advice. I think that they're on the way back, and I think we'll see their product is just light years ahead of the way it was before, and I think they've got their electronics much better than Ford or Chrysler as well. And so I think that General Motors is they'll never get back to where they were, but they'll be one of the top 5 companies, and that's a good thing in itself. And they have to go overseas, and they hadn't done that very well before, and now they're becoming a global company, and I think that's good.
Maybe one last question? Yes.
As you look back on your achievements, is there anything that you would do differently?
Oh, what would I do differently? Oh, yes, I made some mistakes. One big mistake, I think, was we were collecting data from our research, and I think that where we able to own the data, we could do a better job of analyzing and giving the information to each of the dealers in the country, the thousands of dealers that are out there. And we started doing it, and I didn't really have the attention on doing this in a fashion. Actually, it was not developed over the last 5 years before I sold the company, and yet today I wish it had been, because taking the information and analyzing it further was the most important thing we could have done. But we were so busy with all the research we were doing, we didn't find the right people to put it together.
Well, Dave, we thank you very much. There's going to be a